Hi everyone, it's Miss Erin here for another topic session. We're moving on to a new unit now, which is World War II. I'm very excited about doing this topic. I know lots of you were as well. So we'll get started. So today we're going to be looking at the causes of World War II. And there are several different causes linking up together that saw the declaration of World War II happening. So if you want to go ahead and pause the video now to write in today's date and title. Okay, our learning powers for today, as you can see, are absorption, because we're going to be taking on lots of information about the causes of the war, and making links, because we want to see how these events or these different causes linked up together to form the reason why World War II began. We'll look into these words a little bit later on through the lesson. Okay, some total recall. So 1 unit ago, who was the last true pharaoh of Egypt? 2 units ago, what birds did Charles Darwin use to prove his theory of evolution? And 3 units ago, name a natural disaster. So if you want to go ahead, pause the video now and have a go at answering those questions. Okay, so hopefully you remember that the last true pharaoh of Egypt was Cleopatra. The birds that Charles Darwin used were finches, and a natural disaster you could have had hurricanes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, tornadoes, all those kinds of things. Okay, so like we said, we're looking at the causes of World War II this session, and this is the first cause we're going to look at, or this person is the first cause I'm going to say. So hopefully you recognise him, but there are some key questions that hopefully you might be able to answer a few of them now, but we'll look into him in a bit more detail in this lesson, but also throughout the topic. So hopefully you've guessed right. This man here is Adolf Hitler, and he is a very big cause of why World War II began. Adolf Hitler was born on the 20th of April, 1889, in a small Austrian town near to the German border. So Adolf Hitler wasn't a true German. He wasn't a German citizen. He was Austrian. Which, if you wanted to go into lots of detail about it, it is quite unique in the sense that he became the leader of the German party, basically, and led the country. He served in the Bavarian army during World War I and rose to become the leader of Nazi Germany during World War II. He became leader of the Nazi party, political party, who gained power in Germany a few years before World War II broke out. And under his leadership, the Nazis sought to make Germany the most powerful empire in the world and exterminate all they viewed as inferior. Now, we're going to look at a little bit more detail about Germany before World War II broke out in a second, but after World War I, Germany was left very weak, very poor. People were angry in the country. They didn't think that they'd been treated very well by the rest of the world after World War I, and they wanted a leader to take them out of that poverty and desperate situation, hence why Hitler gained power so quickly and he was so popular. But he did have very extreme views about how he was going to make Germany powerful again, and did not like certain aspects of humans, and was very much about getting rid of anybody who he saw as inferior. He ordered the extermination of over 11 million people during World War II, and just slightly before it as well. The majority of them were Jewish, and we're going to look into Hitler's treatment of Jewish people later in the topic, but also including Roman Catholics, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, the handicapped, and any others who did not meet Hitler's standard for racial purity. If you didn't meet his standard, you didn't belong in the world, essentially, according to him. And this mass killing was known as the Holocaust, and we're going to look into a little bit more detail about the Holocaust later in the topic. So he was a very influential man. He was actually a very scary man when you consider what kind of power he had and what he did with that power. And like I said, he's a major cause for World War II. The leaders around the world did not trust Hitler. They found him to be quite a sneaky man, and saw that he had the potential to be very dangerous in terms of leadership. And this little bit down here is just more about him after as the war was ending. It became clear that the Germans would not win. So Hitler retreated to a bunker, and it's been seen that he actually killed himself. He shot himself with a pistol, so with a gun, on April 30th, 1945. So he didn't go to jail for his crimes or anything like that. So that's one of our first causes for war. Our second cause is something known as the Wall Street crash. So after the end of World War I, the American banking system collapsed. This is known as the Wall Street crash. Now, some of you might be thinking, how does the American banking system have anything to do with how World War II began? Well, it did. It had a massive effect, devastating effect almost, on lots of countries, including Britain. Britain didn't avoid the Wall Street crash, but essentially, money all around the world lost its value. Factories closed and millions of people lost their jobs, which meant that there was a lot of poverty and hunger. And this time was known as the Depression. It was a horrible time for lots of people around the world, and Germany in particular was quite affected because of their treatment from the rest of the world after World War I. I'm going to look at that in a second. The Germans were also badly affected, and they were already suffering from the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles, which is going to be our third cause for World War II. So the Treaty of Versailles. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, almost like a contract, if you want to believe it that way, was drawn up to prevent another horrific war and punish the Germans who were blamed for World War I. So the Germans were heavily, heavily punished. After World War I, they were blamed by the rest of the world, and the Treaty of Versailles was almost like a list of consequences, a list of reparations is what they were called, that the Germans had to abide by in order for them to sort of keep their country as it was. They were forced to pay for the war, so they were forced to pay countries money in order to rebuild after the war. Obviously, when you look at places like France in particular, really heavily affected by both world wars, but needed the money to be able to rebuild. They had to disarm their army, navy, and RAF, so they essentially were left with no defences, and it left them really poor. The amount of money that they had to spend, or had to pay, I should say, the fact that they had to get rid of their armies and things like that, made them a very poor country and a very angry country. They believed that they shouldn't have to be punished as badly as this. And then with that on top of the Wall Street crash, and the fact that they were having to still pay money during that time, meant that the country was very, very poor. And actually, when Hitler gained power, he tore up the treaty, and he started to build back up the army and the navy, so that essentially Germany could have its defences back, but the rest of the world saw this as a sort of a really aggressive tactic, and almost like he was getting ready for war again. So this is all just like a bit of a timeline leading up to war. These things didn't happen quickly. It was over several years, but it started with when Hitler gained power, and he started the process of rearmament. So he basically began to build up the armed forces again. In 1935, he introduced conscription. So he was calling all men up to the army. And this actually broke the Treaty of Versailles, but Britain and France let him get away with it. They let him do it. In 1936, he invaded. Hitler took this new force, this armed forces that he'd collected, and he took them and he invaded a place called the Rhineland on 7th of March. Again, this broke the Treaty of Versailles. It was a bluff, though, according to the history books. The German army had only 22,000 soldiers at this point, and had orders to retreat if they met any resistance. But once again, Britain and France, they did nothing. So I know we're talking about Britain and France here. I'm thinking, why aren't any other countries involved? But they were sort of the powerful countries that had the most impact on Germany because they were essentially the closest. And then sort of another timeline event is Austria in 1938. Sorry, Hitler took over Austria, so his homeland. He encouraged the Austrian Nazis to demand union with Germany. Then Hitler invaded it. He said, you know what, I'm just going to walk into the country. Again, this broke the Treaty of Versailles, but still the world did nothing. They let him do it. And then again in 1938, so he's starting to really sort of pick up his pace in terms of the countries that he's invading. So far, between in 2 years span, he's taken over the Rhineland. He has invaded Austria, and now he is taking over a place called the Sudetenland. He encouraged the Sudeten Nazis to just demand union with Germany. So he encouraged them to just join with Germany, not that Germany had to invade them, that they just wanted to join. But he then made plans to invade Czechoslovakia, and Neville Chamberlain, who was the British Prime Minister at the time, appeased Hitler, and we'll talk about appeasement in a second, at Munich on the 29th of September 1938, and Britain and France gave Hitler the Sudetenland. So essentially what they did was, what Hitler said to them was, look, if you give me the Sudetenland, I'll stop. I won't invade any other countries. We'll go back to Germany, and that will be the end of it. And Britain and France believed him. They thought, you know what, I think he's saying, I think we need to believe him. We'll give him the Sudetenland and he'll stop. But of course, Hitler didn't do that. So on the 15th of March 1939, he invaded Czechoslovakia. So he took over the rest of Czechoslovakia. And for most of the British people was the time when they realised that the only thing that would stop Hitler was a war. So, you know, he made a promise, he broke it, and the British people believed that the only way that he was ever going to stop is if they demanded a war. And what the British Prime Minister, or Neville Chamberlain, said at that point was, right, okay, we know he's taken over these, he's gone back on his word. If he invades Poland, we will declare war. And then later in 1939, Hitler tried to take over Poland. First, the Germans in Danzig demanded union with Germany, so they tried to do it peacefully, but then he threatened war. Chamberlain, like I said, promised the Poles that Britain would support them if Germany attacked. And then in August 1939, Hitler made a secret treaty with Russia, really strong power at that point, still is. He thought this would stop Britain and France helping Poland. He believed that if he had a big supporter like Russia behind him, Britain and France would back away and let him sort of invade Poland. And then on the 1st of September 1939, he invaded Poland. But then on the 3rd of September 1939, Chamberlain declared war on Germany. Chamberlain stood behind his word. He said that if he had invaded Poland, they would go to war. He invaded. He declared war on Germany. Okay, so I think it's important to understand who was on whose side, I suppose, when we're thinking about the forces. So the Allied forces, this side was Britain, France, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, India, China, USA. I think that one's supposed to be in. Okay, we'll leave that there. Spain, and then on the German side was obviously Germany, Italy, and Japan. And we'll look in a little bit more detail into Japan later in the topic. Spain, Sweden, and Switzerland were neutral countries. So was Ireland, though many Irish people helped the Allies. So these three countries, Spain, Switzerland, and Sweden, they sort of stayed out of the war as much as they could. But these were all the countries that are eventually invaded by the Germans. Huge amount of area was covered by the Germans or occupied by the Germans. Okay, and then our fourth and final reason that we're going to look at today is Neville Chamberlain, and looking to this idea of appeasement. So the Prime Minister at the time, Neville Chamberlain, believed in the principle of appeasement. He believed that if he gave Hitler elements of what he wanted, he would be happy and stop invading further, like when we talked about the Sudetenland. Okay, he believed that if he gave some of the things that Hitler wanted to him, he would stop. This, of course, did not happen. Many people believed that this was the best course of action at the time, as they'd just been through World War I and they didn't want to go through another war. They wanted peace, so they followed Chamberlain's lead. A lot of the world leaders did the same sort of thing because they couldn't see their countries going back to war. They just survived the First World War and they didn't want to go through it again. And this one here is Neville Chamberlain's famous speech declaring war, finally. Let's see if I can tap on it and get it to work. I'll also send this as a link as well today, so you can have a little listen if you want to.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Gosh, can you imagine being in your front room, listening to that over the wireless, over the radio, and knowing that your country is now going back to war again? Must have been quite a thing. Okay, so we've looked at several different causes for World War II, and when we look at, I suppose, one of those causes, you'd think, oh, that's not that big, I suppose. But when you link them all together, when you build up this picture of Hitler becoming leader of the German party and his extreme views, when we think about the Wall Street crash and how that really affected the whole world, but put a lot more pressure on Germany because they were still repaying things for the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles stripped Germany of a lot of its pride, made German people very angry, made the country very poor and defenceless. And Neville Chamberlain and his structure of appeasement and trying to give Hitler elements of what he wanted and let him gain a lot of power and a lot of ground before war was even declared. When you build up that picture and build up all those causes together, it paints quite a picture in how World War II began. So what I want you to do for me today is, in your topic books, divide your page into 4 sections, just like I've done here, okay? And each section, I want you to write about each of the causes for war. Include what it was, what the consequence would be, and who was involved. All right, so here's the example. I've got the 4 causes, so Hitler, Wall Street crash, Treaty of Versailles, Neville Chamberlain, and in each box, just talk about that cause, what you know about it. Why is it considered a cause for World War II? Okay, so I've already sort of had a little go at filling in the Hitler one for you. I obviously haven't put as much detail in as you could into your box, because you'll have a little bit more space in your books than I have on this page. That's basically what you're doing. But these causes, it's really important for you to understand why they are important. Why do they have an impact on how World War II began? Okay, so that's what you're doing for me today. Hope you've enjoyed this session. Hope you have taken on quite a bit of information about the causes of World War II. And we'll see you again for another topic session soon. Okay, bye.